The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. In a recent piece in The Economist magazine, Vladimir Putin's foreign policy was characterized as, quote, a noxious compound of KGB cynicism and increasingly messianic Russian nationalism. As the U.S. and its European allies search for an appropriate response to Moscow's military adventurism in Ukraine, we've invited two Russia watchers to offer insight into the worldview that drives Mr. Putin's agenda. What lessons do the current inhabitants of the Kremlin take from 2.5 decades of post-Cold War history? How might this shape Russian policy going forward? And what are the implications for Europe and beyond? Joining us in the studio for this look at the world according to Putin is our resident diplomat, John Katzka, who retired from the U.S. Foreign Service after conducting public diplomacy for the Department of State on 4 continents. His career included extensive service in Moscow. Also joining us by phone is Ora John Reuter, assistant professor of political science at UW-Milwaukee, where his teaching and research focus on authoritarian regimes, Russia, and the former Soviet Union. Well, welcome to you both.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm wondering if we could start with a quote from the very first post-Soviet Russian foreign minister, Kozyrev, who says, "The developed nations of the West are Russia's natural allies. It is high time to proclaim firmly at last that we are neither enemies nor junior poor brothers following the instructions of the rich and malevolent West." Well, John, I understand you had some opportunity to spend some time with Minister Kozyrev, and talk a little bit about what really prompted him to make a remark of that.
He was a delightful man, but he was way over his head. He had been the foreign minister of the Russian Socialist Republic, which had no foreign relations, so it really was a meaningless job. And he was thrust into this job when Yeltsin took over and was creating the Commonwealth of Independent States. It was a heady time in Moscow at that time. All the intellectuals were running around trying to come up with economic programs and political reform committees and trying to move this all ahead. It reminds me of one of the things that I recall from my Russian experience, my Russian studies. The Russians abhor chaos, and it was a chaotic time. But it was mostly in Moscow and to a degree in Leningrad, as it was still then called. But the rest of the country was kind of removed from this process.
Well, John Reuter, maybe you could weigh in here. What is your sense of just the mood of that time when after many decades of Cold War and mutual antipathy, suddenly there was this sense of, well, actually we're natural allies, as Minister Kozyrev says?
Yeah, a lot of what I think I agree with a lot of what John says. It was an idealistic period. I think maybe later in the show we might have an opportunity to talk about the foreign policy views that have developed in Russia since then. But there was a short period of idealism in Russian foreign policy. I think in the early 1990s. Although I think I should note, it probably wasn't just idealism in that period. It was also a time when Yeltsin was fighting a struggle against. There was a real concern that the communists might win an election and take over power again. And one of Yeltsin's main objectives was to prevent that from happening. And the West was an ally in that, both both a symbolic ally and also later, as the 90s wore on, was providing loans to Russia. So there was a period there, not just of where the idealistic goals of the West and Russia were united, but also their pragmatic goals.
You remind me, John, of something that I remember from that time. We had gone through the East European experience already, where we were welcomed and they were anxious to take on the democratization programs and the economic reform programs. And we expected that the same thing was going to happen in Moscow. Well, it's a slightly different culture, as I think we all know. And that we were bringing gifts to these people, and there was an enthusiasm because there were things that, we were bringing experts in, we were talking about programs, training elites, and that added to this atmosphere.
So, John, maybe you can just touch on some of the highlights then of that post-Cold War period. I mean, if we're looking at those 2.5 decades, broadly speaking, can you divide it up into eras? I'm sure this is, either John Reuter, how about you?
Well, I think it's difficult to pinpoint a breaking point, but I think if you have to, the war in Kosovo was really I think a bridge too far for the Russians. The expansion of NATO also, I mean, it's debatable the extent to which the Russians were promised that NATO wouldn't expand into Eastern Europe, but the further expansion of NATO no doubt antagonized the Russians. And just as those events were happening at the same time, this period of openness to this period of hunger for new ideas and for learning about what had been going on in the West, talking to Western experts, this idealistic spirit of partnership that reigned in the early 90s just began to fade naturally as well. So it was something of a confluence of factors that began to sour the optimism slightly by the end of the 90s already. Of course, the relationship between, it goes without saying, the relationship between Russia and the United States at the end of the 90s was still infinitely better than it is today. But already by that point, there wasn't the sense of optimism that there was in the early 1990s.
Well, and as often is the case, is there sort of a bread and butter aspect to this? I mean, either one of you can jump in. What about the era where we were providing bush legs? If you want to talk a little bit about what those were, the chicken that the Bush administration was providing.
I hope you know about this one, John.
I don't remember it very well. I mean, unfortunately, I don't think I have much to say about.
Well, I mean, this is it was just emblematic of a bigger issue in which the U.S. was providing extremely subsidized chicken legs, poultry from excess U.S. production, and the once proud Russian people were reduced to eating basically, subsidized chicken legs from the U.S.
Well, what you're talking about is a period from about 92 into the early 2000s, where Russia had to keep its mouth shut because it really wasn't in a position to object too strenuously. I mean, Kosovo was an excellent case in point, but there wasn't much they could do about it. That all changed when energy prices rose and Russia was able to amass a huge reserve that it is now still able to use to be able to assert itself again.
Well, one of the things that I think is an interesting phenomenon is just the glue that held the Soviet Union together. And what was that? I mean, what was the common elements of Soviet culture that somehow was disintegrated in the post-Soviet era, and what's replaced it? John Reuter, maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, as we ended up seeing, in large part, it was roped together through coercion. The constituent republics, that is, if you're talking about the economic and political system, that's a bit of a different conversation. But the geographic unity of the Union was roped together through coercion. There was, and it's not just in Russia, but also in some of the other constituent republics, there was a great sense of pride in the achievements, especially the scientific achievements of the Soviet Union. It wasn't as if, and we'd certainly know this from polls and actual voting results at the time at the end of the Soviet Union, it wasn't as if everyone in the Soviet Union wanted the Soviet Union to collapse. In fact, majorities didn't want it to collapse. And there continues to be, to this day, a great deal of pride in the Soviet Union. It's highest in Russia, but it's also quite high, especially in some of the core republics of the former Soviet Union, Belarus and Ukraine and Kazakhstan. Less so in the Baltics and the Caucasus, I think.
Well, and going even further back, John Katzka, maybe you can talk a little bit about this. What is the narrative, the mythology that Russians tell themselves about Russia's place in the world, in the broad sweep of humanity?
Well, John referred to this pride in being one of the major powers in the world.
But does that predate the Soviet Union?
Well, it predates. Yes, it does. It's a Russian quality. There are some qualities about being Russian that are very different from our own. The role of the individual was never a part of an important factor in Russian culture. Private enterprise. I mean, there was a flirtation with it in the Kerensky days, but it wasn't really all that meaningful. It was more what the state did. And I mentioned earlier the abhorrence of chaos, which is what the Yeltsin period meant to Russians in many respects. And they were looking for someone to come in and sort this all out.
Yeah, I think more generally, I think a lot of that's right. So there isn't the same sense of civic pride in one's country and history as there tends to be in the United States. There's not really a period of Russian history that Russians point to and say that at that point they were proud of their form of government. But there are the things that they're proud of in Russian history is Russian literature, is Russian art and music, the great power status of the Soviet Union, the scientific achievements of the Soviet Union. World War II is the defeat of Nazism, which is World War II, as you can imagine, is a much more important topic in Russia than it is in the West. This was a key moment in Russian history, and they're very proud of that the Soviet state and the Soviet people were able to defeat Nazism. So it's a bit of a pastiche of things that they find pride in. There's also an element people say that every country thinks it's unique, but I think Russia and the United States, they think they're particularly unique, and so Russia and you see this reflected, and hopefully we'll talk about it a bit later. You see this reflected in Russia's current foreign policy stance, is that they do believe that they're that they have a unique role to play in the world. They're a unique culture, and that influences a lot of their foreign policy, I think.
Well, and that's what I would like to talk about really next. That transition between what, John, you characterize as the chaotic period of the Yeltsin era, and how that transitioned into foreign policy and just a sense of self that's much more aligned to some of the things that you were just talking about, John Reuter. But first, we'll take a short break. We'll be back with more International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We are discussing the world according to Putin with John Katzka in the studio, and joining us from New York, John Reuter. Well, when we left to talk a little bit about sort of that period when things were not going particularly well economically and in other ways in Russia. So, John Reuter, talk a little bit about Putin entering the stage and particularly the formation of United Russia as his party, and what kinds of touchstones were they able to draw on to really form the basis of their popularity?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So, as John mentioned earlier, the 1990s in Russia were an extremely chaotic time. There was a deep economic recession in Russia, rivaling the Great Depression in the United States. It was a time of great social dislocation for people as the Soviet welfare state withered. This was all combined at the same time with the collapse, of course, of the Soviet Union as a geopolitical power. So people's pride was injured as well. There was also a breakdown of law and order in Russia during this period. It was very difficult for the government to be able to enforce laws, to make people do what it wanted to do, to collect taxes, things of that nature. So by the end of the 1990s, in the beginning of the 1990s, there was a great deal of idealism and a great deal of enthusiasm about the possibility for building a market economy in Russia, building democracy in Russia, building good relations with the West. By the end of the 1990s and in the early 2000s, that idealistic attitude had, for many Russians, not all, but for many Russians, had soured. And Putin, when he first ran for office, promised a return to order and stability in Russia, and the political party that supported him adopted similar policy platforms. Although it's important to note, this is a common misconception in the West, that from his earliest days, both Putin and United Russia, they were a right of center for Russia political party, and Putin's policy platform has always been right of center. That is, more oriented towards a market economy than the average voter in Russia, more oriented towards cooperation with the West than the average voter in Russia, and actually until very recently, actually less nationalistic than the average voter in Russia. So, especially in the early 2000s, Putin was by many viewed as a successor of Yeltsin, a continuation of his right of center policies. But at the same time, he was also viewed as someone who could extract, by many Russians, he was viewed as someone who could extract Russia from the embarrassing situation that it found itself in the 1990s.
And I would add to that his taking the term just jumped out, the major moguls to task and bringing them under control was viewed, I suspect, very widely and favorably within Russia.
Yes.
So, what are some of the elements of that narrative? That sort of, and in many ways, it's almost pre-Soviet, isn't it?
Well, at first, I think it's worth saying that narrative is only when people began voting for Putin. The popular narrative, and in fact, I just perpetuate a little bit, is that they voted for Putin because he was able to restore law and order. But that wasn't actually the case at all in the in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Putin had not yet been able to pass through in that very early period, in that first election in 2000, had not been able yet to pass through any of the reforms that he had later passed in terms of re-centralizing power and improving state capacity. A lot of what explained, frankly, Putin's electoral success in those early days was Russia's economic turnaround. There was a financial crisis in Russia in 1998, and then right after the financial crisis, Russia's economy, for the first time in almost 10 years, picked up and began to grow, actually, quite rapidly.
So if you have the good fortune to be presiding over a petrochemical exporting nation when the price of oil goes up, you're a genius.
Right, exactly. Now, that just happened to be the same time when oil prices, they reached their lowest point in the summer of 1998 and began going up just after that. So he benefited significantly from those two factors.
I agree. I mean, this is where he was, and it took a few years for them to develop the economic capability, but he was able then to begin the rebuilding of his military. They didn't put a lot into oil infrastructure yet, but he was also able to buy support in the former Soviet, in the near abroad, as they call it, as well as in other places in the world.
Well, so fast forward a bit, and the reserves that those exports generated find Putin and United Russia in comfortable circumstances overall. And so let's talk a little bit about how that translated into what evolved as Russian foreign policy. Is there anything you could point to as a sort of coherent Putin doctrine, if you will?
Well, what I would say, if I may, is that Putin is certainly a realist. I mean, that's my perception. Other people have a different perception. He's a realist and he's a pragmatist. He's a realist in the sense that he views international relations as struggle for influence among great powers. That is not, of course, unique to Putin. That's a doctrine of international relations. I think that the other theme that runs through Putin's foreign policy is that of what he calls sovereignty of Russia. So this idea that Western powers should not influence Russia's domestic policy, its foreign policy, and that Russia has a right to be not only, I think, a sovereign state, which seems obvious, but also to be a great power, an influencer in the world today.
Certainly on the countries around it.
Well, and what about this notion of Russia's duty to protect Russian or Russian-speaking minorities in the region? I mean, is this tactical, or do you think there's a sincere belief that there's a united Russian people who should be under one Russian government?
I don't see it as the latter, looking for the reconnecting of all Russians. I think, as John pointed out, Putin is very pragmatic, and this could be a tactical device to upset the West, to take their if they are worrying about what's happening in the Balkans, are they going to be worrying about what's going on in Ukraine? It can be a way in which to deflect attention. I
agree. I think you might have different guests on your show who might think a little bit differently about what Putin's intentions are, but I typically tend to think of his more nationalist statements as being a means to an end rather than an end in themselves. So I think part of his one of the things that touched off the crisis, the main thing, in fact, that touched off the crisis in Ukraine was that Putin wanted then President of Ukraine Yanukovych to sign an association agreement with an economic bloc that Putin is building in the former Soviet states, and so Putin, I think, sees that as a way to ensure Russia's role in the world in the future. This is a tool for that, and so I think extending influence, more generally extending influence to the other Soviet republics, that's a way to ensure that Russia is going to have a role, rather than just a nationalistic goal to unite all Russians under one flag. I know that he sometimes has that rhetoric, and there are certainly, we can talk about that, elements in the Russian, not just society, but in the Russian political elite that are nationalists. But I don't think that's the driving factor behind Putin's thinking.
Well, John, we've got just about 30 seconds left. I'll give you the last word. John Katzka, what should U.S. policy be towards Russia?
Well, and this is where we get into a dilemma, and I'll try within 30 seconds to pull this out. We have two different ways in which we look at Russia right now. The realists look at this in terms of what are our pragmatic interests with Russia beyond just some of the visceral kinds of things. Idealists are much more caught up in black and white relationships. Putin needs to be stopped. This is bad. These things are...
Unfortunately, you need to be stopped at the
All right.
John Reuter, thank you for joining us from New York. John Katzka, pleasure as always. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,